Welcome to the ITSPmagazine podcast network. You're listening to a new Redefining CyberSecurity podcast with Sean Martin. Have you ever thought that we're selling cybersecurity insincerely, buying it indiscriminately, and deploying it ineffectively? Well, perhaps we are. So let's look at how we can organize a successful InfoSec program that integrates people, process, technology, and culture to drive growth and protect business value. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Imperva is the cybersecurity leader whose mission is to protect data and all paths to it with a suite of integrated application and data security solutions. Learn more at imperva.com.
Pentera, the leader in automation security validation, allows organizations to continuously test the integrity of all cybersecurity layers by emulating real-world attacks at scale to pinpoint the exploitable vulnerabilities and prioritize remediation towards business impact. Learn more at pentera.io.
And here we are. You're very welcome to a new episode of Redefining CyberSecurity here on ITSPmagazine. This is Sean Martin, your host, and I'm thrilled to have Pat Muoio on with us today. Pat, thanks for joining.
Hey, thank you, Sean. Thanks for having me.
And we were introduced, and you have a plethora of topics that we could dig into. We landed on the evolution of the CISO and the role of security in business. You have the fortune of working with a number of startups. You notice I didn't say good fortune, I said fortune, which we'll touch on a bit of that, the relationship between cybersecurity and the startup business and whether or not they have CISOs even, perhaps. Before we get into all of that, though, a brief word from you, Pat, so folks know who you are, how you arrived to what you're doing now, and maybe a sneak peek into what that is as well.
Sure. And this topic is interesting to me because I've gotten to experience it from a bunch of different perspectives. I spent the bulk of my first career, well, all of my first career, at the National Security Agency in a variety of roles, starting as a cryptanalyst, ending up developing security solutions and working on cybersecurity research. So I've been around the cyber topic from the government point of view for a very long time. Also did things in computing and analytics at the agency as well. And when I left the agency, I took a very different turn and joined SineWave Ventures, which is a early stage venture firm. We invest in companies in stage seed A or B, and they're companies that are trying to enable industries that have not traditionally been information driven to use information effectively and safely. So cyber is a big part of our portfolio, although we also include computing and analytics kinds of companies in our portfolio as well. And so in the SineWave role, I get to see CISOs in dealing with diligence with respect to large enterprises and what are they looking for in security products, and also see how security emerges organizationally in the startup world and as the company grows, when the role starts becoming an important one in those companies. So I'm actually eager to explore this topic with you and see where we go with it.
I love it. And I'm going to take you back to the government. And you said something that struck me. And it's not something I've thought about in a while, but you said first career. And I remember when I started working a number of years ago, it was kind of the norm that someone would join a company and that's where they would retire from. And then about, 10, 15 years into that role, things changed. Technology took off. Engineers were needed everywhere, and they took the best offers many times over and over, depending on where they could get the best job, right? And I think there were probably other industries and other functions that had similar drives, if you will. But I'm just wondering, first career, and the reason I'm bringing this up is the role of the CISO, right, is relatively new. We've had the opportunity to chat with Steve Katz, known as the first CISO, and he's talked about its evolution, but it's a fairly new role. So I want to get your perspective on what the role of security looked like when you're working with the government, and perhaps what are some of the differences between then and now?
Yeah, and I do think that's an intriguing place to start. So for one part of my career, where I was actually the CIO of an element in the national security enterprise, and the CISO had a very specific role interfacing with the CIO at that time. There were regulations, guidance, architectures that were security architectures that were established centrally in the agencies, mandated requirements and controls and so on and so forth. And the role of the CISO was to validate that any application or computer installation that was being brought into the enterprise met those requirements and it met the regulations. And it was very much a sort of cop kind of role. They had quite the ability to stand in the way of various projects, but no ability to actually build any of them themselves. It was not a creative role. It was not a role where they got to design the security architecture themselves and then look for products that would make it work. It was a very regulator kind of position. And when the position was cast that way, it obviously, in my mind, was not as successful as it could be, because it was immediately antagonistic, to the operators, to the developers. They were just in the way. It was just paperwork. No one was really talking about what is the actual threat that's motivating these requests for changes, or how is the enterprise going to be better because this is done. And it became, it was a very frustrating check the box kind of activity that I think was actually harmful to the understanding of the role of security in the enterprise infrastructure, and also incredibly frustrating for not only the CISO and the CIO and the operators. It was just not a role that was designed to provide clear value add, but it was a role that had to be, their opinion had to be considered. Contrast this with, I've read stuff about when Katz, was the first CIO, and that role was, to be the security architect, and that was a much more, I think, creative impetus. I think the Citicorp people who hired him realized that security was a business imperative, and that's why that role came about. And I think the difference in the effectiveness in the CIO can partly be accounted for by how clearly security is seen as a business imperative rather than an end in itself. And I think activities that can make that clearer can empower the CISO in important ways and can improve sort of some of the really weird corporate dynamics that I think exist around the CISO role as it's carried out today.
And I'm just thinking back to some of my early days. I was slinging code and then marketing code that or products and solutions that were ending up in government agencies. And the process, and these are security products, so the process to get those solutions vetted was a tremendous amount of work. And so I'm just looking back at this and thinking, okay, so a government agency really cares about security. You talk about the role of the security leader, kind of vetting that those things are properly built and deployed and managed, right? So with the right controls in place. It was a lot of work, but at least we knew what we were getting into. They knew what they were getting into as an agency. And perhaps your thought on this, because back then there were fewer solutions, fewer operating systems, fewer
Mm-hmm.
business processes, perhaps, and so fewer vendors to worry about. And so I'm just wondering, has the scale of technology changed things? And was there a shift where we just had to say, all right, we can't do that much due diligence, that much process, that much checks and balance. Let's just power through and hope for the best in some regard.
Yeah, and I think again this varies at the sort of the assurance level of the enterprise under consideration, but certainly from the government point of view, um, the it is still the case that security and accreditation, that's the painful process that you were talking about, is required of technologies, and there's been many Tiger teams and activities to rebuild the certification and accreditation process, ways to work through continuous certification, but it's still not gone, right? I mean, if you're delivering a large capability to the government, this certification and accreditation process is part of the build. And the fact that there's more technology is certainly increased the complexity in that domain. In the commercial domain, though, the complexity is really increased by the fact that you don't have a strong regulatory statement of what's right in many of those domains, right? In fintech you do, in healthcare you do, to a certain extent. There's NIST frameworks, but they're written, much of this guidance is written in an implementation agnostic way. They don't want to pick winners and losers. They don't want to say use exactly this technology because a new technology might come out that they want it to be open to. And so you don't even have, the CISO is often left without a strong statement that says, yes, you must buy a microsegmentation technology, because the guidance doesn't say you must buy a microsegmentation technology. It says you must structure your network to limit lateral movement, right? And then people have to figure out what that means, and so on and so forth. It's a thankless task in a lot of ways, because there's ambiguity as to what matters, and there's ambiguity as to which solutions answer the questions that matter. And I think, in my mind, a lot of this is rooted in the fact that security practitioners and security designers don't always think about security as a business imperative, but rather as an end in itself. And that leaves them without, I think, a very good compass as to what choices make sense, what's right in this context. You can never go wrong saying you should encrypt things. It is very secure solution, blah, 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 very well received. But there are performance costs, there are operational costs, there are user costs. And so you actually can go wrong picking something that's from a security point of view unassailable, but from an operational point of view problematic. And when you don't think about, why am I protecting this? How much does downtime cost me? How much does loss of PII cost me? How much does loss of intellectual property cost me? How can I make this choice in a business context? It just becomes, because of the amount of technology, as you said, and because of the open-endedness of the regulations, it becomes a very difficult analytic problem to actually lay out what's the implementation that you need to do. And I think many CISOs nowadays find themselves at a loss, right? They don't have clear understanding from their CEO what matters and what doesn't matter, and what they should protect, and how much, how restrictive can they be, and they rely on, what this well-respected CISO, what kind of decisions have they made? I'll make similar ones, and stuff like that. It's a very fraught situation, and it leads to a lot of bad dynamics. It leads to the fact that, and I can get into a ton of these, I probably should stop rambling. But anyhow, there's the issue, like, you bought a technology at the time, it was the best choice. Within a short amount of time, say within a year, a new technology comes out that's actually way more suited for your needs, but you just bought this earlier technology. You don't want to look like you don't know what you're doing. So you don't want to go back and say, I want to rip out this technology and put in this other one because it's better. And so you get, stasis in the architecture that's problematic from a security point of view. Or you make a choice because, the network has to be secure. It turns out that in times of problems, that makes it unavailable. And you haven't, weighed those things against each other. And, there was the Facebook outage where they were out for a number of hours because their security system locked out the guys who would come in and bring the system back up. And the CISO said, this was the right thing. We have to do things to be secure. But the question is, do you have to do things to be secure at the expense of being available? Could there have been a solution that allowed you to be both things? So I guess I'm kind of rambling here, but the point is, it is a hugely complex problem, and part of, if we get to, where might this role move, how might this role evolve to be more successful? I think we have to untangle what are the different roles and what are the different tensions within that role to see where it's best placed and whether it's even actually one role or many.
Yeah, and a lot of the conversations we have here where we talk about the growing scope and scale of responsibility for CISO the conversations tend to be rooted in technologies, right? There's new technologies for business processes, or new technologies for protection, new technologies for monitoring and whatever. And therefore we need team members. Well, the CISO needs to understand kind of that big picture, and then needs to staff a team that understands it all. And so maybe we can touch on that, but I also want to maybe kind of point to the business models are driving a lot of these changes. And I don't know if that's a factor here. I'm just thinking the platform business model, for example, or APIs and open everything, right? Banking and open healthcare, whatever, pick your favorite thing. So big changes like that also make things a little more challenging too.
Yeah, and that's certainly the case. I mean, businesses that, health insurance, not that long ago, you would not have web access to your health insurance records. You would not get your lab test results online, right? And that put what was usually sort of offline information right out there in a much riskier environment. And that leaves you with very, very different challenges about how you do that business in an online way, which is much different than how you would do it in an offline way. And I think, and that's where, this issue of taking all the concerns kind of jointly. Once you've committed to being an online business, not only does that mean your security requirements have changed and your security problem is more difficult, it also means your availability becomes much more significant as well, right? You have to be up. People go to look for this valuable banking document. They can't find it. They get very anxious. They get, troubled. What happened to my money if it's, something goes wrong with their banking app? And the balancing, keeping the system up with keeping it secure, how do you pick technologies that address both those needs jointly? It makes the job one that I don't think can be done effectively by security personnel in isolation. And I think that's part of the problem with the CISO world. As people began to see cybersecurity as a more important concern, they made it its own thing. Right, there was the security team, and the implementations were done. The technology was bought. The implementations were done by the security team rather than by the network team or the infrastructure team that deals with all the rest of the business stuff. And you get a lot of integration issues because they weren't thought of at the same time. You also buy security technology you might not need because it could be, you want to keep your branches in the East Coast from talking to your branches on the West Coast, and you buy firewalls and stuff to keep them apart. But it could be your existing network solution could have separated those subnets in an assured way. not as a security activity, but as a networking activity, right? A managed network controls who could talk to whom. And so I think having yanked the security thinking out of the thinking of the business is leading to a lot of problems, and complicates this adjusting to new business models, complicates picking new technologies, because I think when some of the other concerns are brought to bear, the technology choice actually becomes easier, right? Some things become no-brainer goods or bads. If you think about, well, what's that going to do to have my users sign on to the system? If I don't have any users that are going, if I don't have a security team that's going to analyze threats, threat detection is probably not a technology I need to buy. And so part of what I think would make the CISO role easier and more effective is closer integration with engineering, with IT, with network, rather than moving it out to this, other role, so that security is its own thing that the people who are building and running the enterprise feel they don't have any responsibility for, when actually they do.
And
so
I'm glad you went there, and I don't know if we have more to say on this, but I'm just thinking about movements like DevOps to DevSecOps, right?
Mhm.
Where
Mhm.
security is kind of part of, rather than just looking in on.
Yep.
And you mentioned the networking example, where perhaps security in the networking team would identify controls and procedures that would eliminate the need for more solutions and tools that frankly make things more complicated anyway. And also,
Mhm.
you talked about encryption earlier, right? Yes, encryption is great, but if you don't really understand it and know how to manage the keys and rotate the
Mhm.
keys, you can end up in a worse position, right?
Yep.
Thinking you're safe, and when you're really not. So I don't know if you have any experience or any insights into areas where the CISO has kind of made some of those changes beyond some of the ones, or examples of some of the ones we've touched on here.
Yeah. Oh, now I'm sorry I didn't go back through my notes. I talked to two companies that reevaluated the CISO role and decided to put the CISO in engineering, not to sort of demote him into engineering, but to have the role closely tied to the engineering activities, where in that enterprise, the engineering is what, built the code and also maintain the enterprise deployment of the code. And they found that to be very, very successful. For one, it wasn't something, security was no longer something that was being done to the engineers, it was something being done by the engineers to achieve this security objective. And that alone was a lot of value add. But the ability to understand the context, understand the workflows in which the security technology has to operate, enabled the CISO to make better recommendations and choices about what controls and solutions would be helpful, given the way that workflow is rolled out, rather than say, here's a security technology that we like, change your workflow to accommodate it. And so there were two different enterprises that did that move to put the CISO closer to engineering and IT. And in both cases, they were happy about that. The contrary thing is, there's this whole risk management aspect to the CISO job, identifying risk, making sure that the risks to the enterprise are understood and correctly evaluated as to their impact and so on. And that role is one that that portion of the role is one that might not be appropriately done in engineering, but would be effectively done along with the risk management that addresses other types of risk, climate risk or financial risk or health and safety risk. And then when you're starting thinking about risk in this holistic way, where the security risk is contributes to your understanding of those other risks and is influenced by your understanding of the other risks, the picture becomes again clearer because these other lenses are brought on it. And so I mean, I read a description of the CISO's role at one point that had so many things that they were supposed to do that, you know, no single human would have a brain that was good at both the high level thinking, the detail oriented thinking, the test specific, the technical level of thinking, the risk level of thinking. Nobody has that brain. And I think that we've gone to the point where we really need to see how we can break up the role to put portions of it in the places where it would be most effective in the enterprise. And I think some experiments in that area are taking place and seem to be successful.
Yeah, and I think it's a trend that I'm seeing and hearing, and it started with the conversation with Steve Katz. He actually said that we'll probably end up in a place where we have multiple CISOs, and I remember having a conversation to your point on risk. I don't know if this pigeonholes security into risk and forgets some of the other things, but one of the large movie companies, their CISO operated under risk and was responsible for looking at securing endpoints, securing data, and how much risk is involved there, coupled with how much risk is involved with a stunt person getting blown up and shot out of a car on a So very, very different way of thinking about things. And we haven't even touched on so we've talked security, we've talked risk. We haven't even touched on privacy yet, which is a whole another thing where the privacy in some regards is less about protecting and more about how we can safely use collecting data, which kind of goes against some of the controls in some cases. And so I guess the bottom line is we're not going to solve this problem today, but there's a lot to go on the shoulders of a CISO, and presumably they either need sub-CISOs or company needs multiple CISOs or something along those lines to really get a grasp of this. Let's turn to some of the activities you're involved in and have seen from a smaller organization perspective. So the startups, the seeds to bees folks.
Yeah.
I mean, their whole goal in life is to build something that matters and get it to market as quickly as possible. And they only have that A round of runway, right?
Right.
And can't afford a CISO and a bunch of technologies, and until they get some traction. And so how are you seeing some of that play out?
As you say, virtually all startups are in a hurry to get to market, need to deliver to milestones that are often overambitious to begin with. They don't have a lot of spare cash, and I think it's fairly universal that security takes a backseat on most of their early build time. And you're left with the situation that the technology is largely built before security concerns are beginning to be addressed, and then they become quite expensive to address because you didn't architect in a way that enables them. One thing that I try to do with the companies in our portfolio that I advise is to not, obviously it's not the case you want to slow them down, it's not the case you want to burden them with extra costs, but they can think without dollars and without a lot of extra time. And so think about the security that's going to be required of this. If this is a technology that is going to need to be security aware, or it's going to be deployed in industries that are security sensitive, you need to think when you architect about how you can accommodate controls, even if you don't stop right now to implement those controls. You have places to put them readily. You've exposed your APIs in ways they can be introduced with little pain later on. That kind of thinking early on, I think, is hugely important. mostly the only security requirement that I've seen actually ever levied on a startup by a customer is that they be SOC 2 compliant, and a lot of that is process definition and very, very fundamental controls. And even that is sometimes considered very burdensome by companies that are running fast as they can to get something out. So it is a problem that this security is part of what you're building from the beginning is not element of the startup culture. It's very countervailing to a lot of the pressures of the startup culture. And I think that is something over time that we're going to have to address. I think, as you mentioned earlier, DevSecOps, as that becomes a more standard way of operating, then startup developers will begin to understand and introduce some of those security measures much more readily. But I think
sorry to pause you. In that they come from a larger organization where they've had a DevSecOps program and they bring that knowledge with them. Yeah,
bring it with them. Yeah, and I think this puts not a mandate, but I mean I think this means the security development tools, code analysis tools, other kinds of testing tools really need to become friendly and naturally fit into the DevOps workflow. And right now, a lot of them don't and see themselves again as something extra. They're the check that happens after the code is, at build one, and when they go figure it out. But it has to be, with these rapid check-ins, the security checks are made and so on. So I think there'll be an evolution in security development tooling and a lot of what we look for investments specifically in that space that would enable developers that are not security persons to develop secure code. And I think that's going to be an important change in technology over the future. And I think, 5 years from now, with the development of technologies like that, we can expect the base of code to be less messy than it currently is, and that needs to happen because we as a nation, as a world, we can't keep chasing vulnerabilities one after the other and attacks one after the other. We have to find ways to systemically reduce the problem in our code base and to just make things better from the get-go. But yeah, you're right. In the startup world, it is not part of the culture to worry about that, and we need to make it so that developers at all points in the economic spectrum can have security as a sort of element of their development without great cost or without having to gain other expertise.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm a huge champion, and people listen to the show probably think I'm a robot on this point, just repeating the same thing over and over. But I truly and firmly believe that if you can define what you're building with security in mind, not only will it be more secure from the beginning, but perhaps you can eliminate the need for a bunch of the controls required to fill the gaps later. So if you're not doing some transactions a certain way, you don't have to monitor them to look for fraud.
Right.
Or if they're not making that network connection over this port using this channel or whatever, then you don't have to actually monitor that or put firewalls in place or what have you. So I know oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, please continue. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just thinking that we were kind of talking about the startup here, but this is true for any size business. And yeah, I think there's an opportunity there. And so I guess my point and maybe question to you is how does a CISO go about kind of getting that mindset, if you
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. And I do think thinking about your code, in my mind, it actually comes down to a measure of elegance. If you think about what you're doing and do what needs to be done and nothing else, and have this elegant code structure, and rather than this sort of Byzantine thing where you just throw a bunch of stuff, I'm sure you've seen code that what the kind of code I'm alluding to. I think you are better off. You can secure well thought through code more easily than you can secure thrown together code. The point is now, how can the CISO instill that? And I think the CISO as configured now can't, right? Because the CISO is just so far removed from the development process that his or her voice is not heard in that domain. And they are thought as not understanding what it takes to be a developer. I think the part of this mindset needs to come in programming education, but I think the engineering leadership needs to instill that in people. I think there needs to be and maybe maybe if the CISO is moved closer to engineering, then that will be easier to happen. But it can't come from outside. It can't be, that's why people say, oh, well, the government should just tell people what to do. I mean, if somebody just tells you what to do without you actually understanding why it matters in your context, it's not going to work. And I think the CISO has been crippled in dealing with developers. We have a couple of companies that have to sell. I mean, and as I said, we're interested in secure tools that help secure the development environment. Well, who do you sell that to, right? The CISO obviously sees the need, but the engineering guy has to buy it and deploy it in his process. And that complex sale crossing departments has been the death of several startups, because it's the enterprise is not set up with security as a sort of cross-cutting concern for all departments. It puts security in a department and then everybody else. And that really causes some serious problems and makes it very, very difficult for the CISO to have a voice in developer practice, development mindset, anything like that.
Yeah, and I could easily follow you down that path of products built to fit in, right? So security products from vendors built to fit into the engineering workflows. But I'm gonna go the other direction though, and so not just the CISO pairing and integrating and becoming one with engineering, but product management, maybe the team that actually defines things. And perhaps before that, I can go to architect as another level. I can go to strategist as one. And I don't know if that's the CEO in many cases, or some companies have their own dedicated strategists. But those are the big thinkers saying we need to transition from this single license to, I mean, this isn't happening anymore, but from licensed software to subscription, right? Somebody think about that changed many years ago. Transition to the cloud, transition to platform engineering, transition to whatever. How does can a CISO get connected at that level?
I think as currently defined, it's problematic, but I think that, to your point, the sooner in the ideation process the CISO is engaged, the better, right? It should be at strategy. It should be at architecture. There's choices you can make, go to the cloud or not. The business imperative to go to the cloud is strong. Okay, we're going to go to the cloud. We need to know that we're introducing these additional risks, and we need to go to the cloud in a way that mitigates that, right? And that's not, if you have that from the get-go in your analysis of your move to the cloud, it's not difficult, and it's not an added expense. It won't slow you down. It will just help you make choices that move you to the cloud in a more secure way. If instead you move to the cloud and then say, oh damn, now we have to secure, Now you have to have technologies that you add on, that you have to make sure they integrate with this, that, and the other thing. And the problem is more difficult to do the later in the process that you try to make the solution. And so I think the ideal place for the CISO to operate is the architect level. The business decides, it has these imperatives, it wants to make these large strategic moves. Now we need to figure out how, and the CISO needs to have a strong voice in the how. Before any of the movement to build that happens. And I think that's where the CISO could be truly effective. I don't think in many enterprises that is the role they're playing. And part of this, earlier on you talked about first career, second career. One of the things that I think is interesting is to how the CISO role developed in this kind of awkward way. Early on, there were not a whole lot of security practitioners available in the marketplace. And a lot of the people that were hired as the first CISOs were retired military who had filled that role or had filled other policy roles in the military. And that brought with it a mindset that's different than let's make security an enabler, let's make security satisfy our business imperatives. And that got kind of entrenched in the thinking for a very long time. And I think we need to kind of work through the bad image of the CISO as a check the box guy or a regulator kind of guy, and move towards the image of the CISO as an enabler, a designer, an architect.
Yep, I love it. Yeah, I'm just I'm thinking back to the perimeter. Everything was about the perimeter before.
Yeah, exactly.
Around the same time that this role came to fruition. Yeah, so a lot has changed, much more to change moving forward. And I mean, we're already at 4 minutes. I don't know how time flew so fast. We must be having fun, Pat.
Oh, yeah, really?
But this is a great conversation. I'd love to keep chatting with you. Maybe you come back and we can peel the onion on some other topics or take this one further. I'm going to put a call out because a lot of these conversations are, at least in my mind, theoretical. And I don't know, somebody has to have kind of, to your two examples of the CISO connecting at the engineering, CISO connecting at the IT level. There have to be CISOs who've actually done these transitions. So I'd love to hear from them. Maybe, I don't know if you know somebody, we can bring them back on. If anybody else wants to join me, we can dig into some of those stories as well. But Pat, it's been fantastic. I appreciate you joining me here today. Any final thoughts for the listeners before we?
No, I think this was a good conversation. I thank you for having me. And sorry if I ran on a bit on some of these things, but I tend to get passionate about some of these issues. And happy to come back if it makes sense for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and sometimes the extra few words are where the nuggets are. So I think we uncovered a few here, at least. Kind of to your point, your advice to your startups: think. That's my main objective of the show as well. Think about what you're doing. You may not have the answer, but if you think about it, you might have a better chance of finding it.
Exactly.
All right. Well, Pat, thanks so much for joining me today. Thanks everybody for listening, watching the show, and catch you on the next Redefining CyberSecurity.
Pantera, the leader in automation security validation, allows organizations to continuously test the integrity of all cybersecurity layers by emulating real-world attacks at scale to pinpoint the exploitable vulnerabilities and prioritize remediation towards business impact. Learn more at pantera.io.
Imperva is the cybersecurity leader whose mission is to protect data and all paths to it with a suite of integrated application and data security solutions. Learn more at imperva.com.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Redefining Cybersecurity with Sean Martin, part of the ITSPmagazine podcast network. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then share this channel and ITSPmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. And you can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.